Theatres attract tales of ghosts and hauntings like few other types of building. The Theatre Royal in London's Drury Lane is no exception at all. Now, the current Theatre Royal in Covent Garden dates to 1812, and it's actually the fourth incarnation on the site since 1663. You can even find 18th century foundations below ground level. The third incarnation of the theatre burned down in 1809, and it was most notorious for being the location of a failed assassination attempt. Would-be assassin James Hadfield tried to murder King George III there in 1800. He fired shots from the pit, but being jostled, missed on all counts. The king calmly ordered the play to continue once Hadfield was arrested. But the stories of the resident ghosts have passed into local theatre legend, and the tale of the man in grey is perhaps the most oft-repeated story. So let's take a walk into London's cultural scene and find out who he is in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Spooky season is continuing here on the podcast and we are going to have a look at another ghost story in a theatre. This time, however, we are relocating from my hometown of Newcastle upon Tyne and going to London, which is, I consider, sort of my second hometown because I did live there for so long. But I always find theatres absolutely fascinating in terms of the number of them that seem to have some kind of ghost attached to them. And some people call the Theatre Royal on London's Drury Lane either the most haunted theatre in London, some call it the most haunted theatre in Britain. I've even seen people call it the most haunted theatre in the world, but I think that might be stretching it just a tad. We are going to look at it in terms of its main ghost and then also have a look at some of the side players as well. Now, I did mention the man in grey in the introduction, and he is perhaps the most famous of the ghosts at the Theatre Royal. And he also makes something of a change from the grey lady ghosts that we often find in British theatres, and obviously we met two of those last week. Now, according to the legend, actors only see him between the hours of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. He wears a tricorn hat, a powdered wig or powdered hair, no one's really sure which one it is, a long grey riding cloak and riding boots. Now, the fact that the description is relatively specific shows you kind of how many times there have been sightings of him that people have been able to put together some kind of composite. Now, the man in grey sits in the same seat in the upper circle. Apparently this is towards the end of the fourth row. And then he gets up, he strides along the walkway behind the seats, and then when he reaches a particular spot on the wall near the royal box, he melts away and disappears. So far, so spectral. Now, the fact that he sits in the same spot and disappears in the same area would suggest that this is a ghost replaying an incident. And this is the kind of thing that you often get in a lot of horror films and ghost stories, the fact that the ghost is simply replaying something that happened to them in the way that the building is kind of held onto a memory. It does also suggest some form of routine, that our man in grey was a man of habit, which may give us some clues as to what's going on, but we'll get to those in a moment. Now, what stands out about the man in grey is that he's not a phantom that inspires fear and dread, quite the opposite in fact, and this is where I think he differs so much from a lot of other theatrical ghosts. Because whenever the man in grey appears at a matinee performance or a rehearsal, the play goes on to be a huge success. And according to the legends, he endorsed The King and I, South Pacific and Oklahoma, among others. And he even appeared at Miss Saigon every time the cast changed. All of these productions were box office hits. Does this make him a good omen for the Theatre Royal? Possibly. It does also make me wonder what he actually did during lockdown. Was he still sitting waiting for something to happen on stage, or has he found some other means of entertaining himself? We'll probably never know. So, who is he? Well, no one has been able to uncover a specific name for him, which I think is a shame. But we all know how much I like to dig into these stories. Now, the folktales around him claim that he was a wealthy gentleman in the early 18th century, and he was embroiled in a passionate affair with an actress, and then he would meet her, as you might have guessed it, in the upper circle after performances. One night, a rival lay in wait for him, so instead of greeting his sweetheart, the man in grey encountered his murderer. The rival stabbed the gentleman in the chest and then hid his body in a wall recess at the back of the upper circle, and the murderer then later walled up the alcove. Now, surprisingly, a refurbishment of the theatre in 1848 actually revealed a wall cavity in the upper circle. Lo and behold, it contained a skeleton with a knife in its ribs. Could this be our mysterious man in grey? It is possible after all, but others wonder if the legend has actually emerged backwards, extrapolated from the body found in the wall. One of the things that I sort of find a little bit irksome about this story is the fact that without a name, it's impossible to know. Now, if he was that wealthy, surely somebody would have noticed his absence and might have then been able to find out where he had gone and discover him. I want to know how the rival managed to actually get access to wall up something in a theatre, which kind of implies it must have been an employee of some description to be able to lie there and wait after the performance and also build a wall in a theatre that nobody apparently noticed at the time. Now, we can look that it must have happened somewhere between 1812, when this incarnation of the theatre reopened, and 1848. So surely someone at some point may have gone, hang on, we haven't seen our chap for a while. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is the fact that he only appears between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m, but he seems like such a creature of habit. And surely if he was obviously murdered after one of the performances, why does he appear in such a specific window? I don't know. I'm just picking holes at this point. I do think it's a really interesting story, and I think that the fact that we have tales of sightings of him, but then there's always been something positive about that, I just think makes it really cool. But ultimately, though, the question that we're going to ask is the legend true? Now, the entire cast of the Dancing Years apparently saw him in 1939, and the theatre's resident historian, W.J. McQueen Pope, puffed up tales of the mass sighting. Now, this is a problem, and some people doubt the veracity of the mass sighting because McQueen Pope was also the Theatre Royal's advertising manager as well as being the theatre historian. So what better way to guarantee that the play is going to be a success than to say that the entire cast of a play saw the man in grey before the play basically began. So it's an interesting little way of getting people into your theatre, but there we go. Now, I have found it difficult to find many direct records of eyewitness accounts because most of the online sources say things like, people have seen this or that ghost, and they don't really go into specifics. But the man in grey did apparently reportedly tell ushers to shush as recently as 2012, although no names were given, so I don't know which ushers were told to shush. But I did quite like the fact that the man in grey is sitting there like, you're ruining the performance. Now, according to the Yorkshire Observer, King George VI actually visited the theatre in November 1939 to meet the NAFI players who were leaving to entertain troops in France, and a theatre employee for some reason told the king about the man in grey, explaining he'd last been seen last March. Now, whether he meant March 1939 or March 1938 is a little bit tricky, but there we go. It's also not clear who saw the man in grey or during which performance, but it is quite interesting that there had been a sighting recently enough of him that someone was able to tell the king about it. But I did find an article in the Sunday Mirror from the 5th of February 1939 that mentioned spooky activity in the Theatre Royal. And actress Doreen Austen explained that, and I quote, "I have never seen the ghost but once during rehearsals when the principal girl, Greta Fane, and I had stayed later than the others to go through a tap dance routine. The girl who was coaching us suddenly stopped and said, 'Who was that sitting in the stalls?' We all looked, but there was nobody there at all." End quote. Obviously, remember that the man in grey prefers sitting in the upper circle, but maybe he wanted a better view this time. Or perhaps they saw a different one of the ghosts in the Theatre Royal in the stalls. We don't really know. But it's quite interesting that the actors almost seem alert to the possibility that they will see someone in the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Now, the man in grey isn't the only resident spectre, and actor Charles Macklin also apparently haunts the theatre. So in 1735, so this would be a previous version of the theatre, he argued with his fellow actor Thomas Hallam about a wig, and he lashed out with his cane, piercing Hallam's left eye and killing him. And according to theatre law, Macklin's ghost wanders in the corridor where the killing happened. Obviously, we need to bear in mind that that would have actually been in a previous version of the theatre, so he's just more in the general area, not the specific corridor in which it happened. Other reports involved tugged trouser legs, people hearing their name called, swing doors moving of their own accord, or hearing sharp intakes of breath in empty rooms. And one actor actually reported the channel changing on his dressing room TV whenever he and a colleague talked about the theatre ghosts. Performer Joseph Grimaldi also haunts several parts of the theatre, and actors, ushers and cleaners report mischievous kicks when they go about their business. A disembodied white face has been seen around the theatre, which is particularly seen in the boxes. Now, that might sound like a bit of a bizarre apparition, but Grimaldi did apparently ask for his head to be decapitated before burial, so that might explain things. Now, many actors actually believe that Grimaldi nudges performers around the stage to improve their positioning, but he's also not averse to giving them a kick if he feels they're not putting in enough effort, and some performers have reported actually being patted on the back whenever they get laughs. Leno, another clown, often portrayed pantomime dames at the theatre. He suffered from incontinence and hid the smell with lavender perfume. Now, he died aged 43 in 1904, but the scent of lavender apparently still hangs around the theatre. Now, Leno was also famous for his clog dancing routine, and people have reported the sound of rhythmic drumming inside his former dressing room. So we have to wonder, is he still rehearsing even now? Now, what's interesting about this pair of clown ghosts is the fact that Grimaldi was the resident clown at the second Theatre Royal, and this one was demolished in 1791 and replaced with a larger theatre that reopened in 1794. Leno and the Man in Grey, however, date to the current incarnation of the Theatre Royal, so it does beg the question that if Grimaldi is haunting the building, then he's obviously very attached to the site. And I think this is what makes the difference between the performer ghosts and the Man in Grey, because the Man in Grey is not ever considered to have been an actor himself, rather someone in love with one of the performers. So he's kind of stuck in the theatre, replaying what happened to him in obviously a tragic fashion, whereas Grimaldi and Leno and Macklin appear to remain where they were happiest and where they obviously did a bulk of their work. So it is quite interesting how these spectres become attached to these theatres and these buildings. And I do almost like the idea that they kind of get to choose which one they would rather spend eternity in. Now, we do have to wonder why theatres attract so many ghosts. And given the number of people who actually die in hospitals, you'd expect hospitals to be more haunted than theatres. But theatres around the country boast far more tales of phantoms and spectres, and many of the ghosts remain even when the theatres disappear. Obviously, look at the different ghosts in this episode, how some of them date to earlier incarnations of the building on the site, but yet they're still appearing obviously within the theatre because it's now on the site of what used to be there when they were there. Now, the Royal Strand Theatre originally stood on the site now occupied by the disused Aldwych Tube Station in London, and according to legend, a ghostly actress still wanders the tracks bothering the maintenance men. Apparently she hasn't got the memo that the theatre is no longer there. And Victorian actor William Terrace was murdered at the stage door of the Adelphi Theatre in 1897, and he's actually been seen wandering round in the Covent Garden tube station, but also knocking on dressing room doors in the theatre itself. So could ghosts be attracted to theatres because of the vast range of emotions played out on stage? Are actors simply more susceptible to presences from the other side, making them more likely to see ghosts when they're in these theatres? Indeed, in an article that Nigel Planer wrote for the Huffington Post, he does note how creepy a lot of theatres actually do feel when you're in them and they're not full of people. And indeed, I can actually attest to that because I went to see a performance by Don't Go Into the Cellar, who are an excellent theatre company, at the Tyne Theatre. And rather than us sitting in the stalls and the usual places in the theatre, they actually put the seating on the stage. And it was a very, very strange sensation being on the stage and being able to see all the machinery and everything that makes the magic happen kind of backstage. And then kind of looking out towards like the empty seats. And it did make you wonder, are they empty? You know, is there anybody else there? So there is something actually quite creepy about theatres when they're being used in a slightly different fashion and they're not full of an adoring audience. Now, Aoife Monks also suggests that the actors who see these ghosts perhaps do so as a way to connect to their theatrical heritage. So seeing a legendary ghost may help them feel like they've joined the acting family. But I want to know, what do you think? Is your local theatre haunted? Do you have a grey lady ghost or a man in grey or something similar? I mean, I think anyone who can kind of top the Man in Grey with the sense that he then also seems to dictate whether a production is a success or not, I think that's quite impressive. But please do let me know if your local theatres are haunted. Obviously, some theatres have been converted into other things. Do cinemas have the same level of activity attached to them? Who knows? But please do let me know what you think. You can reply to the comments on the blog post that this podcast episode is for, or you can contact me on the social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram and Facebook and let me know. If you've ever seen the Man in Grey yourself, again, please do let me know, because that would be really cool to hear from someone who'd actually seen him. Next week, we're going to move on to the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, which is the Bank of England ghost, because that one's a pretty cool story, so we're going to do that. And if you are a Patreon supporter, I will be dropping the first of 2 exclusive audio clips of local ghost stories from somewhere around the UK very, very soon, so you can look forward to that. And that is for anyone who's at the $150 a month or higher tier. you will get that storytelling based episode as well. And I did also want to alert you to the fact that if you are free on the 28th of October at 6 p.m. UK time, I am doing an online talk with Cresswell Crags where we are going to be having a look at where some popular current Halloween traditions came from. And the link to book tickets is in the show notes. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode. Please do let me know about any ghostly goings on in theatres near you. And I did actually wiggle my fingers in a ghostly fashion there, and I don't know why, because this is audio, but there we go. That's how we roll here on Fabulous Folklore. But without any further ado, I will let you crack on with your week. If you are going to the theatre at any point, please do pay attention to who might be sitting next to you, because they may not just simply be another punter. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.